Welcome to our deep dive into the ego.
Okay.
We're going way beyond just the psych view,
Right.
and we're going to explore the ego from a spiritual perspective this time.
Sounds good.
We've got some really fascinating sources
Yeah.
to unpack today that reveal how the ego isn't just, good or bad,
Mm-hmm.
but a force with the potential to both hinder and help us on the path of personal growth.
Yeah, that's true.
The ego is often portrayed as something we need to conquer,
Right.
but it's way more nuanced than that.
It's more complicated.
Yeah.
It can be like a wild card,
Oh,
capable of tripping us up, but also propelling us forward on our journeys.
yeah. So before we get too far,
Okay.
let's define what we're actually even talking about when we say ego. We
Right.
hear this word all the time,
All the time.
but it seems to mean a million different things to different people.
Well, in everyday conversations,
Yeah,
ego often refers to our sense of self,
right.
our ambitions, and how we interact with others. It's that me at the center of our experiences.
That makes sense psychologically.
Yeah.
Like our ego is kind of what helps us make decisions,
Uh-huh.
set boundaries, navigate the world around us.
Exactly.
So when we bring spirituality into the picture, though,
Yeah.
things get a little more intriguing.
Yeah. For example, Sufi psychology
Okay.
uses the term nafs
Yeah?
to describe a spectrum of our being, from like our base instincts to our refined self.
So it's not just about squashing our instincts, but understanding how they fit into our overall growth.
Yeah, you got it.
Wow.
It challenges the whole idea that the ego needs to be eradicated.
Hmm.
Instead, it suggests that even our base desires,
Right.
can be a starting point for spiritual development.
Okay.
Think about it. Like, have you ever noticed how an impulse or a trait you considered negative
Mm-hmm.
actually led you to like a deeper self-understanding?
That's a great question to consider. Like
Yeah.
those times when you act impulsively and it leads to a consequence that forces you to learn something about yourself.
Exactly. And this leads us to like Eckhart Tolle,
Okay.
who describes the ego as an identification with thought patterns and roles that can obscure our true nature.
So it's like we get so caught up in our thoughts, our
Huh.
to-do lists,
Yeah.
our social identities that we lose sight of who we really are beneath all of that.
100%. These thoughts and roles provide a sense of continuity,
Right.
but they can also trap us in like limiting beliefs and behaviors.
Okay, so we're starting to see how the ego isn't just a simple, good or bad thing.
Yeah.
It has this dual nature that can be both protective and potentially harmful at the same time.
That's a great way to put it. Like, it's two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
One side is the ego as a protective mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
like setting boundaries, helping us build confidence, enabling us to get things done.
Which are all essential for navigating the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, we see the downsides of an overactive ego. And this is where feelings of isolation, jealousy, and a constant need for validation come into play.
Oh, I think we've all been there.
We've all been there.
That feeling of needing to prove yourself constantly,
Yeah.
to be right all the time,
Mhm.
it can be exhausting.
Oh, yeah, it certainly can.
So how do we reconcile these two sides?
That's the big question.
If the ego isn't inherently bad but can clearly cause problems,
Yeah.
where do we go from here?
Well, Frithjof Schuon
Okay.
presents a very fascinating perspective. He suggests that the ego is not the enemy,
Okay.
but a child of the spirit.
A child of the spirit?
Mm.
That's an interesting way to look at it, but isn't that a bit romanticized?
Whoa.
How can we reconcile that idea with the ego's potential for harm?
Schuon's point is that the ego, like a child, needs guidance and integration.
Okay.
It's not about suppressing it,
Right.
but about teaching it,
Yeah.
helping it evolve.
Okay.
Just like we wouldn't simply try to eliminate a child's mischievousness.
Right.
We wouldn't want to eradicate the ego entirely. We need to guide it towards a more mature expression.
So it's about helping our inner child grow up, learning to manage those impulses,
Yes.
to make choices that align with our deeper values and purpose.
You got it.
Okay, so now that we're starting to understand the dual nature of the ego, let's explore how different spiritual traditions view this child of the spirit and its role in our overall growth.
Sounds good. So many spiritual traditions offer like really valuable insights into understanding and working with the ego.
Okay.
For example, the article from Mind That Ego
Okay.
highlights how the ego, as part of our intellect, can actually be a tool for growth.
That's a bit of a plot twist.
Right.
I think we usually see the intellect and ego as being at odds with spirituality.
Yeah, it's a common misconception.
Okay.
The key is to recognize that the ego is just one part of our intellect,
Right.
not the totality of who we are.
Right, because if we over-identify with our thoughts and ego-driven desires,
Right.
we never get to the core of our being.
It's exactly. Many spiritual practices emphasize non-judgmental observation of ego-driven thoughts.
Okay.
It's about creating space between our thoughts and reactions,
Okay.
allowing us to make more conscious choices.
So that's where mindfulness comes in.
Exactly.
It's about observing those thoughts without getting swept away by them.
Precisely, mindfulness helps us hit the pause button before our ego takes over.
Okay.
And it reminds me of something Russell Dalglish said about managing the ego.
Oh, all ears. What's his take?
Well, Dalglish believes that acceptance and self-awareness are key to managing the ego.
Okay.
When we own our decisions, even the not-so-great ones,
Hmm.
and let go of the need to be right all the time.
We can build more genuine connections.
Yeah.
It's hard to connect authentically when you're constantly trying to prove yourself.
Exactly. So inspired by Dalglish's wisdom on acceptance.
Okay.
Let's dive into some practices that can help us integrate the ego.
Let's get practical.
Yeah.
I know our listener is eager for some actionable advice.
One powerful practice is self-inquiry. Take time to ask yourself, who am I beyond these thoughts and labels that my ego keeps throwing at me?
That's where journaling and meditation can be so helpful.
Yes,
Just creating that space to explore what lies beneath the surface.
right. Journaling and meditation help us tap into our inner wisdom, the voice that gets drowned out by the ego's chatter.
Right.
And of course, mindfulness is crucial.
Yeah, we talked about observing thoughts without immediately reacting.
Right.
It's like hitting the pause button before letting the ego take the wheel.
Exactly. We create space for conscious choice rather than just reacting on autopilot.
I love that analogy. So we've got self-inquiry, mindfulness.
Hmm.
What other practices can help us on this path of ego integration?
Many spiritual traditions emphasize the cultivation of specific virtues.
Okay.
Things like humility, compassion, and honesty.
So these virtues are like antidotes to those pesky, negative, ego-driven tendencies.
Yes, they help us align our ego with a deeper purpose, something bigger than ourselves.
And then there are specific spiritual practices that can help us shift our perspective.
Yeah.
Things like meditation prayer or Sufi dhikr.
Yeah, these practices can be powerful tools for recognizing the ego's role without letting it define us.
Okay.
It's about creating separation, that
Mhm.
awareness that the ego is just one part of us, not the whole story.
Right. It's not about obliterating the ego altogether. It's
Right.
about integrating it, working with it rather than against it.
Precisely transforming it from a potential obstacle into an ally.
Okay, so this idea of integration is really resonating with me.
Yeah.
But how does this actually play out in our lives?
Yeah.
What does it look like to have this harmonious relationship with the ego?
It's a gradual shift, a process of moving from a self-centered identity to a more expansive sense of connection with something larger.
So instead of just focusing on me, myself, and I,
Yeah,
we start to see ourselves as part of a greater whole.
exactly. And this shift in perspective has profound implications.
Okay.
Our need for external validation diminishes.
Mm-hmm.
We become less concerned with what others think,
Mm-hmm.
and we focus more on living in alignment with our values and inner truth.
That sounds incredibly liberating, like a huge weight lifted off your shoulders.
It frees up so much energy when we're not constantly seeking approval and validation.
Yeah. And as we continue on this path, our actions become more aligned with our inner truth and with compassion.
Precisely, the ego, which once caused separation and conflict, can actually become a bridge to connection and unity.
That's a beautiful way to think about it.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, what you resist persists.
Right.
The more we try to fight or deny the ego, the stronger its hold becomes.
Exactly. It's through acceptance, understanding, and integration that we can truly transform its energy.
Okay.
And that's where spiritual intelligence comes into play.
Spiritual intelligence now, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Spiritual intelligence is the ability to reflect, reframe challenges, learn from setbacks, and continuously evolve.
Okay.
It's about recognizing the ego's potential as a stepping stone to higher consciousness.
So it's not about reaching some perfect state of enlightenment,
Right. Yeah.
but about embracing the journey of growth and evolution.
Exactly. The more we practice self-awareness, mindfulness, and those virtues we discussed,
Mm-hmm.
the more we strengthen our ability to integrate the ego.
Okay.
It becomes a way of life.
I love that it becomes less about effort and more about a natural unfolding.
Precisely. But I know what you're thinking.
Oh, you can read my mind now.
Perhaps. But
Oh.
seriously, you're probably wondering if it's truly possible to reach this level of integration and harmony with our ego.
Well, I have to admit, it does sound a bit idealistic.
Yeah.
Like, is it really achievable in our everyday lives?
That's a valid question. And honestly, it's a journey with ups and downs,
Okay.
moments of clarity and moments of confusion.
So it's not about perfection,
Right.
but about embracing the process, even the messy parts.
Exactly. The key
Yeah.
is to approach it with patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to keep learning and growing.
Okay.
And it's important to acknowledge that we're doing this work within a culture that often glorifies the very ego-driven tendencies that lead to separation and disconnection.
That's a great point. Our culture constantly bombards us with messages about individual achievement competition
Yeah.
and the pursuit of external validation.
It's true. It can feel like we're swimming upstream,
Yeah.
trying to cultivate humility and connection in a world that often prizes self-promotion.
So how do we navigate that tension?
Yeah.
How do we stay true to this path of integration amidst all that noise?
It comes down to choice. Even amidst the chaos, we always have the power to choose to align with different values,
Okay.
to prioritize our inner growth over external validation.
It's like we're consciously choosing a different path, one that leads to genuine fulfillment rather than chasing fleeting external rewards.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming our power and realizing that true fulfillment comes from within, not from external sources.
That realization is incredibly empowering. It gives
Yeah.
us the courage to be ourselves, to embrace our imperfections, and to live a life guided by our inner compass.
Beautifully said, and that's the beauty of this work.
Yeah.
It's not about conforming to some rigid set of rules or achieving some arbitrary level of perfection.
Yeah.
It's about discovering who we truly are beneath the layers of conditioning and ego-driven desires.
It's about peeling back those layers to reveal the authentic self that's been there all along, waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And as we continue on this path of self-discovery, we start to see the world with new eyes. We recognize the interconnectedness of all things,
Yeah.
the inherent beauty in every moment, the infinite potential for growth and transformation.
It's like waking up to a whole new reality. A reality filled with love, compassion, and a deep sense of belonging.
And that's the ultimate goal of this journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
To reconnect with our true nature, to experience the fullness of our being, and to live in harmony with ourselves, with others, and with the world around us.
What a powerful vision. It's inspiring to think about the possibilities that open up when we embark on this journey of ego integration. But I know our listener is eager to hear about some more practical strategies for working with the ego in everyday life.
Absolutely. Let's take a short break and we'll come back with some specific tools and techniques to help you navigate the complex terrain of the ego.
All right, so we're back
Yes.
and ready to dive into those practical strategies
Yeah.
for working with the ego.
Okay.
We've talked about its dual nature,
Right.
its potential for both growth and trouble.
Hmm.
And now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of
Yeah.
how to manage this tricky part of ourselves.
Yeah, it's not always easy,
Yeah.
but I think like the first step is just acknowledging that.
Okay.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Yeah.
It's about finding what resonates with you,
Right.
what feels authentic to your own journey and personality.
Yeah, I love that. It
Yeah.
takes the pressure off
Right.
of having to follow some rigid set of rules.
Exactly.
So with that in mind, what are some practices and perspectives
Right,
that
well-
can be helpful in navigating the ego's terrain?
Well, we've already touched on a few key practices like self-inquiry and mindfulness,
Right.
but it's worth emphasizing how powerful they can be in creating a more harmonious relationship with the ego.
So let's unpack those a bit more.
Yeah.
What do those practices actually look like in everyday life?
Okay, so self-inquiry
Yeah.
invites us to question like our thoughts and beliefs,
Hmm.
to really dig beneath the surface of our ego-driven identities.
Okay.
It's about taking the time to explore who we are beyond the roles and labels that we often cling to.
Yeah, so it's not just about thinking about who we are, but
Well,
really questioning those assumptions and stories
Yeah.
we tell ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where practices like journaling and meditation can be so valuable.
Right.
They provide the space and stillness to connect with our inner wisdom,
Right.
that quiet voice that often gets drowned out by the ego's chatter.
Yeah, I find that journaling can be especially helpful. When I'm feeling overwhelmed or caught up in a cycle of negative self-talk,
Oh, yeah.
it's like getting those thoughts out of my head and onto the page
Totally.
allows me to see them more objectively.
Absolutely. And as we create this space for self-reflection,
Mm-hmm.
we start to gain a deeper understanding of like our values, our motivations, our true desires.
Okay.
We begin to see how our ego has been driving our choices and behaviors.
And that awareness is crucial because once we see those patterns,
Yeah,
we can start to make different choices.
exactly.
Choices that are more aligned with our authentic selves
Yes.
rather than the ego's need for control or validation.
You hit the nail on the head. And alongside self-inquiry,
Mm-hmm.
cultivating mindfulness is another essential practice.
Yeah.
It's the ability to observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment,
Okay.
to simply notice them as they arise and pass away.
I used to think mindfulness was all about emptying my mind
Right.
and achieving some sort of blissful state. But I've come to realize it's more about becoming aware of those mental and emotional patterns
Right.
without getting swept away by them.
It's a beautiful shift in perspective.
Yeah.
It's about creating that space between stimulus and response.
Right.
So we're not just reacting on autopilot.
Yeah.
We're actually taking a moment to pause, reflect, and choose how we want to respond.
That reminds me of something you said earlier about hitting the pause button before the ego takes over.
Yeah.
It's like we're taking back control of the wheel.
Precisely. And that pause, that moment of conscious awareness, is where the magic happens.
Right.
Because in that space, we disengage from the ego's grip
Yeah.
and tap into our own inner wisdom and compassion.
And it's a practice we can weave into our daily lives.
Yes.
Right? It's not just about formal meditation.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
about bringing that awareness to our everyday interactions, conversations,
Yeah.
even the mundane tasks.
Right. It's about cultivating a state of presence, of being fully engaged in the moment, rather than lost in the mental chatter of the ego.
And the more we practice this, the less reactive we become,
Yeah.
and the more we're able to respond to life's challenges with grace.
Exactly.
So we've got these core practices of self-inquiry and mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
but what about when things get tough?
Yeah.
How can we work with the ego when we inevitably encounter setbacks or challenges?
Well, the ego loves to personalize everything.
Right.
It tries to convince us that, like, every setback is a reflection of our worth or abilities.
Oh, yeah, I know that voice all too well.
Yeah.
It's the one that chimes in with,
Yeah.
see, I told you weren't good enough, or
Yes.
this always happens to me.
Exactly. And in those moments, it's crucial to remember that our thoughts are not facts.
Right.
They're just thoughts.
Okay.
Transient mental events that come and go.
Okay.
We don't have to believe everything we think.
We can learn to challenge those thoughts, too, right?
Exactly.
We can question their validity, look for evidence that supports or contradicts them,
Yeah.
and even reframe them in a more empowering light.
Yes. Often when we do that,
Mm-hmm.
we find those negative thoughts are based on distorted perceptions or limiting beliefs
Mm-hmm.
that we've been carrying around for years.
Right.
And by bringing those beliefs to the surface, we can start to dismantle them and create space for more compassionate and realistic perspectives.
This brings us back to the importance of cultivating virtues like humility, compassion, and honesty.
Yeah, those virtues are like the foundation for a healthy relationship with the ego.
Okay.
They help us loosen its grip. Humility allows us to see ourselves more clearly
Mm-hmm.
without needing to inflate our importance.
Right.
Compassion helps us extend kindness to ourselves and others,
Yeah.
even when we make mistakes.
Right.
And honesty keeps us grounded in reality,
Mm-hmm.
rather than getting lost in the ego's fantasies and illusions.
I love how those virtues create a space for growth and learning,
Yeah,
rather than getting bogged down by the ego's negativity.
exactly. And the more we cultivate these qualities, the more we find that our ego naturally starts to align with a deeper purpose.
Yeah. Oh.
We're no longer solely motivated by self-interest or the need for external validation.
Mm-hmm.
We're driven by a desire to contribute, to live a life that's meaningful and fulfilling.
It's like the ego transforms from this self-serving entity
Yeah.
into an instrument for something greater,
Yeah.
a vehicle for service, creativity, and connection.
You've captured it beautifully, and that's the power of this work.
Yeah.
It's not about suppressing or eradicating the ego.
Yeah.
It's about understanding its role, integrating its energy, and directing it towards something positive and transformative.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what's the key takeaway you'd like to leave our listener with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the ego is not the enemy.
Okay.
It's a part of who we are, an aspect of our human experience.
Right.
The key is to become aware of its tendencies, to
Mhm.
cultivate practices that help us manage its energy, and ultimately to transform it into an ally on our journey towards greater consciousness and connection.
And to remember that journey is ongoing.
Yeah.
There will be times when we feel like we're mastering this.
Yes.
And times when we stumble and fall back into old patterns.
Exactly. But the important thing is to keep practicing, to keep learning, and to keep growing.
Right.
And to remember that we're not alone in this.
Yeah.
We're all navigating this complex terrain of the ego,
Yeah.
striving to live more authentic and meaningful lives.
It's comforting to know we're all in this together.
Yeah, it is.
So thank you for joining us on this exploration of the ego.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights and tools to help you on your own journey.
Yes.
And remember, keep exploring, keep evolving, and keep embracing the fullness of who you are.
Absolutely.